Imagine a U.S. Central Command MH-60 helicopter, hovering low over the open waters of the Gulf of Oman, locking onto a Panama-flagged cargo ship called the MV Villanova. And what followed wasn't a warning shot. On Tuesday, August 11th, 2026, that helicopter fired two Hellfire missiles directly into the engine room of this massive commercial vessel. Welcome to the Clarinary Show Daily World Brief.
That level of kinetic military action against a commercial vessel is incredibly jarring, but it's the concrete reality of the United States' ongoing blockade of Iranian ports right now. This is a direct continuation of the war between Iran and the U.S.-Israeli coalition that broke out back on February 28, 2026.
And we know Central Command stated the civilian crew actually ignored repeated radio warnings before the strike.
Yeah.
But help me translate a disabled steering gear in the Gulf of Oman into what it means for someone listening to this at home. Because a maritime blockade isn't just a logistics problem for some shipping conglomerate.
Right. It translates directly and painfully into the primary driver of global inflation that we are all experiencing today. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. So when a route like that is effectively closed by active missile fire, the mechanisms of global trade break down rapidly. Maritime insurance firms either refuse to underwrite voyages through the Gulf altogether, or they raise their premiums to astronomical levels.
Which forces these conglomerates into a brutal calculation. They either pay those exorbitant premiums and risk their crew and cargo, or they completely reroute their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa.
And that rerouting adds anywhere from 10 to 14 days to a standard voyage. That means massive, unforeseen expenditures in marine diesel fuel, millions of dollars in extra crew wages, and a sudden shortage of global container capacity, simply because ships are tied up at sea for weeks longer than scheduled.
And those cascading costs obviously do not get absorbed by the shipping companies. They are passed directly downstream into the prices of everyday consumer goods. And crucially, they dictate this severe strain we're seeing on household energy budgets, forcing governments into terrible domestic policy choices just to keep the lights on.
Exactly. And while the military is openly projecting this overwhelming dominance in the Gulf, behind the scenes, that same geopolitical conflict is forcing the administration into some incredibly extreme, covert security protocols. Look at an operation the Secret Service executed just over a month ago on July 8.
The plane swap, right. After the NATO summit in Turkey, President Donald Trump boarded Air Force One in Ankara entirely in front of the assembled television cameras. The press corps literally watched him walk up the stairs. But once he was out of sight inside the cabin, the Secret Service quietly smuggled the president off the plane out of the airport and into the back of a catering truck.
They essentially used the recognizable profile of the Boeing 747 as a massive, multi-million-dollar stage prop. While the decoy Air Force One flew back with a cabin full of unwitting journalists who were under strict orders to keep their window shades firmly pulled down, the president was spirited away in that catering vehicle to a completely different location.
Wait, they loaded him onto a much smaller, far less conspicuous C-32A military aircraft operating under the obscure call sign Reach 18, which ultimately flew him to the United Kingdom. But the administration has spent months going on television to broadcast the absolute frailty of Iran's conventional military. How do we reconcile that public rhetoric of total U.S. supremacy with the stark reality of stuffing the commander-in-chief into a catering truck just to get him out of a NATO summit safely?
The contradiction you're pointing out is really the defining characteristic of modern asymmetric warfare. A nation-state like Iran might be thoroughly degraded in terms of its conventional head-to-head battlefield strength. They obviously cannot defeat a U.S. carrier strike group, but they still possess the capacity for targeted, catastrophic strikes that completely circumvent traditional military dominance.
Because the intelligence prompting this elaborate maneuver pointed to a highly credible Iranian missile threat specifically targeting the president's aircraft. And this isn't an isolated threat. We've seen a very long string of assassination plots directly linked to this ongoing conflict.
Yes, Iran has explicitly and repeatedly threatened the U.S. president ever since the 2020 killing of Qasem Soleimani, and we saw those threats amplify significantly following the 2025 U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities. The intelligence community has disrupted tangible plots on U.S. soil, including a Pakistani man arrested in July 2024 and an Afghani citizen charged shortly after.
So the secrecy surrounding that July 8 plane swap, which they managed to keep entirely quiet for over a month, serves a dual purpose. It protects the physical operational tactics from being studied by adversaries, but it also protects the political narrative of invulnerability that the administration desperately wants to project.
Precisely. Now, speaking of wealth and power exerting itself to avoid conventional rules, let's pivot to a domestic arena where massive financial forces are quietly reshaping democratic institutions from the inside.
Yeah.
We are watching a flood of Silicon Valley money pour into U.S. politics with one singular goal, which is fighting off artificial intelligence regulation.
Yeah, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg recently published this massive 6,500-word essay advocating for a strictly laissez-faire approach to AI development. He is actively warning governments against passing any regulations that might slow down the tech industry. What does that financial weight actually look like on the ground?
It looks like tech billionaires, notably OpenAI's Greg Brockman and Palantir's Joe Lonsdale, funneling millions of dollars into super PACs, like a group called Leading the Future. The explicit mandate of these PACs is to aggressively fund pro-AI candidates and ruthlessly primary anyone advocating for oversight.
And we can look at the very concrete example of Alex Bors. He was a New York State assemblyman who pioneered AI regulation at the state level, proposing basic guardrails like algorithmic transparency, requiring companies to disclose training data, and establishing liability frameworks if an AI system causes measurable harm.
But the tech PACs saw that state-level legislation as a dangerous precedent. They dropped a $6 million smear campaign on his district and successfully defeated him in his primary race.
And the staggering part is they didn't even spend that $6 million debating his stance on technology. They just blasted the airwaves with attacks on his progressive credentials to get him out of the way. The glaring irony in Zuckerberg's essay is hard to ignore here. He spends 6,500 words warning the public that a small set of experts shouldn't get to decide what is best for humanity. Yet, an unelected tech oligarchy is deploying immense wealth to buy elections and dictate our legislative future.
It is highly reminiscent of the cryptocurrency industry's political playbook from the 2024 cycle. Capital is being systematically weaponized to drown out dissenting voices in the public square.
For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, you can always visit clarinaratio.com. Now, if the U.S. tech sector is a story about wealthy individuals trying to bypass democratic regulation, Hungary is currently offering a masterclass in what happens when entrenched political power is actually dismantled using the levers of the state.
Right. Following a landslide election, Prime Minister Peter Magyar's Tuzabel party has moved aggressively to dismantle the remnants of Viktor Orban's regime.
How exactly do you legally dismantle a regime that has spent years embedding itself into the courts and the presidency? I mean, what are the actual mechanics of that?
You use the exact same mechanisms they use to consolidate power. Magyar's party utilized its new, massive parliamentary supermajority to fundamentally amend the constitution. They used those amendments to cut short the term of President Tamás Sulyok, who was deeply allied with former Prime Minister Orban and seen as a major roadblock to reforms.
And they replaced him with András Baka, which is a fascinating choice because Baka is the former head of the Supreme Court and a very staunch critic of Orban. In fact, Orban had him removed from his judicial role over a decade ago.
This creates a profound civic paradox for observers watching Hungary right now. Magyar is utilizing winner-takes-all legal tactics and blunt parliamentary force to clean house. It forces a very uncomfortable question. Can a nation genuinely restore independent institutions and democratic norms by wielding the same illiberal strongman tactics that broke the system in the first place?
And Baka himself addressed this tension directly in his acceptance speech to Parliament, didn't he? He acknowledged that Orban's state officials were originally appointed specifically to ensure the political survival of the old regime, but he explicitly warned that the country cannot build a healthy new democratic system purely on a foundation of revenge.
Exactly. And while political factions are fighting over constitutional frameworks and billionaires are fighting over tech regulation, the physical environment that these institutions are supposed to govern is just buckling under historic extremes. The devastation in the U.S. Pacific Northwest right now is unprecedented.
Over 2.9 million acres have burned across Washington and Oregon this year alone. In the suburbs of Spokane, Washington, 846 structures have been completely consumed by wildfires. These aren't just patches of remote forests we're talking about. These are whole neighborhoods reduced to ash and twisted metal.
And if we zoom out from the Pacific Northwest, we're looking at a systemic, global strain on infrastructure driven by environmental extremes. A critical example is unfolding in Germany right now on the Rhine River, which is a vital artery for European cargo shipping. The water level at the Kalb gauge point has dropped to a near-record low of just 24 centimeters.
Explain the mechanics of that gauge point, because 24 centimeters of water doesn't sound like a river that can support commercial shipping at all. That's practically a puddle.
It dictates the draft of the vessels, essentially the amount of clearance a ship needs beneath its hull to avoid scraping the riverbed. So at 24 centimeters at Kalb, those massive transport barges are forced to shed immense amounts of weight just to stay afloat. They are currently running at only 20% of their normal capacity.
So you suddenly need 5 ships to transport the exact same amount of coal or chemical cargo that one ship used to carry.
Precisely. And that bottleneck sends transport costs absolutely skyrocketing. Moving a ton of cargo on the Rhine has jumped from 45 euros up to 160 euros. And this water crisis is highly distributed. In Puerto Rico, severe droughts are resulting in strict municipal water rationing for residents.
And back in Europe, Hungary's only nuclear power plant is currently struggling simply to secure enough cooling water from the Danube River to operate safely. This raises a massive question about how our governments prioritize threats. If a foreign military had dropped bombs and destroyed 846 homes in the suburbs of Spokane, the national mobilization would be absolute. It would command every resource the federal government possesses.
But because the destruction comes from climate-exaggerated wildfires fueled by a looming El Niño, the government response is essentially relegated to triage. The terminology reflects that triage, actually. Fire agencies are currently operating at preparedness level 5.
Which is the highest possible level of strain, meaning federal and state resources are fully deployed, firefighters are utterly exhausted, and some lower priority fires simply receive no response at all because there is literally no one left to send. Environmental destruction rarely triggers the same immediate civic urgency or military-style mobilization as a geopolitical threat, even when the human impact entire neighborhoods wiped off the map is completely identical.
We seem wired to react to an enemy with a face, but we simply manage the fallout when the attacker is an atmospheric phenomenon. Navigating these systemic failures brings us to a really interesting development regarding human impact and civic society in the Middle East, though. The parliament in Lebanon has just voted to officially abolish the death penalty.
That makes Lebanon the first country in the Middle East to formally end the practice. So what are they replacing capital punishment with?
They are replacing it with a sentence of life imprisonment with hard labor. It's the culmination of 3 decades of relentless campaigning by local civil society groups, specifically organizations like the Lebanese Association for Civil Rights.
And the mechanics of getting this passed must have required building agonizingly slow coalitions across deeply divided sectarian lines within that parliament.
Completely. What makes this a landmark move is the context. Lebanon is a nation currently besieged by a severe multi-year financial crisis and the constant violent ripple effects of regional war. It proves that even when the broader economic and security systems are collapsing around them, tangible human rights and moral progress can still be legislated by dedicated citizens.
That theme of humane action enduring despite overlapping crises brings us to a final grounding detail for you to mull over today. The stories we covered, global supply chains failing under missile fire, political systems warped by Silicon Valley wealth, climates behaving in terrifying new ways, show distinct pressures pulling the world in very different volatile directions. But over in the UK, a man named Stephen Jaland offers a very different framework for response.
Yeah, he started offering to clear hopelessly overgrown gardens for complete strangers, entirely for free. Jaland has battled his own severe depression, and he recognized a very specific psychological mechanic, which is that an unmanageable physical space severely compounds anxiety and shame.
So he takes an old mower and physically wades into brambles that are 2 meters high. He clears out immediate fire hazards for housebound individuals, and he restores safe, usable spaces for families who are completely overwhelmed by dealing with things like cancer treatments.
He even launched a small crowdfunding effort recently and raised roughly $930 just to buy new tools to keep the project going.
He can't fix the shipping lanes in the Gulf of Oman, and he can't dredge the Rhine River, but he can restore dignity and a sense of order to a neighbor's immediate environment. When the vast, abstract systems we rely on begin to buckle, the most immediate form of civic power we have left might simply be direct, unbureaucratic kindness to the people physically closest to us. While we cannot control the geopolitics above us, we can still cultivate the ground right beneath our own feet. Thank you for joining us. For more Daily World Briefs and classic audiobooks, visit clarineratio.com.